I'm Tammy Proctor. I'm the department head in history, and we've got a great panel for you tonight. We also thought, we should warm up the crowd like they do before, the Conan show and other, the Late Late Show and all that. So I have what we're referring to as the truth ball here. What I'm going to do is throw it out into the audience. I promise it won't hurt. And if the ball comes to you, don't just bat it to someone else. You need to catch the ball and then say the first word that comes to your head in relationship to whatever word was said before. So the first word will be truth. So, whoever gets it first has the easy job of whatever is close to truth. The next person needs to say a word that is close to what the person before them said. Does that make sense? Have I lost you? No. Okay, say it loud, and I'll repeat it so that the rest of the room can hear. And be sure to bat it around the room so it's not just the people in the front that get to say something. We want to make it around. So, are you ready? Yeah? So the first word is truth. Somebody's got to take it. Honest. Honest is the next one. Throw it backwards, forwards, whatever. All right, who gets it? Somebody's going to have to claim it. Say it louder. Sorry. Abraham Lincoln. Okay. Next one. No, it can't be an empty chair. Somebody has to take it. Integrity. Okay, throw it somewhere else. I see you guys dodging. That's not the point of this game. Somebody pick it up. Okay, somebody's got it. Loud. Virtue. Good one. Okay. Couple more. Oh. Virtue. Chaste. Okay, good. Excellent. All right, throw it on. Woo, here it comes. Watch out. Who's got one? Chaste. Objectivity. Okay. Let's throw it over this way. This side is not getting any love, so it needs to go over here, too. One more here. Objectivity was the one. Say a little louder. Goodness. Okay, goodness. Now, this side needs it because they haven't had a chance. So somebody over here. Oh, yeah, good. Goodness. Greatness. All right, backwards. Somebody else, yeah. Whoa. Spectacular. Okay, one more. Who wants to be have the last word after spectacular? The aisle. So sad. Dr. Sanders. Somebody. All right. Last word.
Tacos.
Tacos. All right. Yay. All right. Thank you. So we are planning to have the possibility of asking a lot of questions tonight. And let's see if I can make this advance. We have two options for asking questions. One is if you have a smartphone, you can go to Slido, which is up here, to post the questions. And the event code is 3843, and you'll see live any questions you put up. You can also do a little thumbs up for other people's questions that you like, and I'll be collecting them, and we'll try to answer some of them at the end. If you don't have a smartphone or you don't want to use it, we also have cards. Britt has them here, and the Q&A, she'll be coming around and passing them out if you want one. So please participate in the discussion both during our presentation, and then there'll be a reception at 6, followed by another group discussion in the room across the hall. So you've got lots of opportunities to be part of this. A couple of quick announcements. There's a slide at the end for selfies. I'm sure hardly anyone in here is after extra credit, but if you are, there's a slide at the end. And the organizers wanted me to let you know as well that there are 2 more Facticity panels in the spring, February 13th and March 13th. So watch out for those. So we had kind of an interesting topic to deal with tonight, truth and lies. And I thought, as a historian, it might be fun to bring in the words of a German playwright from the 1930s, Bertolt Brecht, who tried to sort of think about what it meant to tell the truth in a public place. This is a quote from one of his pieces from 1935. Nowadays, anyone who wishes to combat lies and ignorance and to write the truth must overcome at least 5 difficulties. One must have the courage to write the truth when truth is everywhere opposed, the keenness to recognize it, although it is everywhere concealed, the skill to manipulate it as a weapon, the judgment to select those in whose hands it will be effective, and the cunning to spread the truth among such persons. I think all 4 of our presenters today are going to be touching on some of these issues, the issues of courage, keenness, skill, judgment, cunning. And so I'd like to introduce our panel and have them come forward. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them all at the beginning, and then they'll speak in turn. So from Whence Truth, Melissa Tehee from Psychology. Competing Truths, Jennifer Peeples from Communication Studies. Manufacturing Truth, Jason Gilmore from Global Communication. And Fake News, Cathy Bullock from Journalism and Communication. So please join me in welcoming all our speakers. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to start, and you can start sending questions in at any point if something comes to your brain.
All right, can you all hear me on this one? What if I'm back here? Okay. So I am trained as a clinical psychologist and a lawyer, and so when we started talking about this and I was thinking about this, this classic sort of psychology test came to mind. So here we go.
This is an awareness test. How many times does the team in white pass the ball? If you answered 13 passes, you are correct. But did you see the moonwalking gorilla?
So that is just to sort of get us started in thinking about truth and sort of perception and attention. So where does our truth come from? I mean, so there's the argument of, do we all have the same truth? But truth often depends on our perception. So how many people have experienced the same event as somebody else, and when you go to tell the story, that story is different than you would have told it, right? Like that perception is different. My mom and I always tell a different story. Beliefs, that's really the state of mind in which a person thinks something to be the case, and oftentimes that can be with or without any sort of evidence to prove that. And then we all have values, and this is really a person's principles or standards for our behavior, but really what underlies that is what we judge to be really important in life. So underlying sort of the things that I just talked about in perception is our worldview. And our worldview is the shared values and assumptions and customs, norms, and things that our institutions are based upon. It's really the psychological perception of what the world of, like our perception of the world and what we determine to be true, what leads us to think, feel, and behave differently. So our worldviews really our values are oftentimes under there with that, and that shapes our beliefs, and from there shapes how we think, how we act, right? So to go along with this is this idea of sort of cultural and societal programming. So this is, how do we get our information, right? How do you know what our values are, right? These are things that we sort of start to really grasp and grow from a very, very early age. And these come from many places, and I have just put a couple up here, right? So parents and family, religion talks about what our values are, behaviors, our school, right? So what the curriculum is, the history that you learn, the media, who you see represented on TV, how they are represented. Those things all shape our perception. And then our news sources. So if you ever look at different news sources, if you look at news sources at all, those are things that oftentimes contradict. But if you are only looking at one source of news, you sort of get a different perception of things. So what about when you are faced with facts that challenge your sort of cultural, social programming, and your beliefs? How do people react to that? So looking at behavior in psychology, we have an attentional bias, right? So that is the tendency to pay attention to some things while simultaneously ignoring other things. So in that video, the important thing was how many times the people in white passed the ball. You did not count how many times the people in black passed the ball, and a bunch of people who have never seen the video before missed the gorilla, right? So what was important in that moment is what you paid attention to. Confirmation bias is when we sort of seek out information that confirms our beliefs, our values, our perception, and we do not seek out information that would contradict that at all. So oftentimes we'll overlook that, or that was a one-time thing, right? That wasn't statistically significant. That's not likely to happen again. These other things are. We have an attribution bias, which is really common in individualistic societies, and that's where people sort of assign cause to like a behavior or something like that to a person's individual character versus like societal norms or things that are happening within the context. So to add in here, I think one of the reasons we oftentimes believe and hold on to our beliefs in the face of other information is our ego. So we are invested in supporting the things we have long believed. It takes a lot to let go of those. And then conformity and assimilation. So that is acting in accord with the prevailing social standards to fit in a group. And so people in individualistic societies really want to sort of say like, oh, I'm not a conformist, but we all are. We are all like sitting in a classroom right now facing the front. Like there are rules and things that are happening all the time. So here's just a cartoon here. But this is the idea that there are more than one truth. There are more truths happening at one given time, depending on how you look at the situation. And really, there's a big difference between judging, and judging a situation in the moment is really the opposite from understanding. You cannot be understanding from another person's perspective and be judging at the same time.
Language is a system of symbols. So why is this important? Because it means that the language we use is never the thing itself. Earth, the letters, the sound, when I say it, earth, is a symbol. It's not the lovely blue and green land and water covered planet we inhabit. It is a symbol that English speakers use to represent this place. We can understand this relationship between the symbol and the thing more clearly when we look at some of the other symbols used to represent the planet. There is no natural relationship between the symbol and the thing. Speakers of the same language just agree what the symbol means. This becomes problematic when we try to speak a material truth, explain it to others. We're reliant on the system of symbols, and we know that even small changes in the symbol can impact the meaning of the thing we're trying to explain. Is this the earth, a world, a planet, a globe? A world? All are correct, but they have slightly different feelings, slightly different meanings. This imprecise nature of language is always at play when we try to articulate a truth. For example, we know the earth is warming. This is a physical reality. For those whose livelihoods require being accurate, rational, and factual, such as those in the sciences, they try to get their symbols as close to the material reality as language allows. As we attempt to explain the broader issues and concerns having to do with the warming earth, concepts that are more abstract maybe than temperature, symbols play an even greater role. Is what we are experiencing climate change, global warming, a natural phenomenon, human-caused catastrophe? How do we ensure climate justice? Are we now in the Anthropocene? And what the heck is the Anthropocene? Because we're required to use symbols to communicate, even a whole dictionary's worth, we can never perfectly represent the complexity and all the aspects of material reality. But that doesn't mean that all symbolic constructions are equally true. For example, to say that the planet is cooling, or global warming is a hoax, does not match the material reality of a warming planet. You can say it, but it still isn't accurate or true. In fact, some would say it's a lie. To say someone is lying in the technical sphere of science, research, law, or fabricating information as a journalist can have serious consequences. It doesn't, however, work the same way in the public sphere, the place where people engage with each other in conversations, arguments, debates, and questions about shared substances, shared concerns, and public interests, places like this. To say someone is lying in response to a blog can backfire in the public sphere, making the speaker sound naggish or maybe childish. It frequently doesn't work in the way it's intended. For example, even with all the fact-checking mechanisms in the last election, no one was held accountable for complete fabrications. Why? Language can give us this insight. While at times closely aligning itself with physical reality, language can also express things that are abstract. We talk about hopes and dreams and beliefs and values in the future, all things without a direct material counterpart, but are still of importance to people as they make decisions. While it's important to hold people accountable, whether they're speaking of concrete facts or abstract realities, as we can see from the case of President Reagan, that can be difficult. In his speeches, Reagan loved to tell stories. He told the one about Albert Einstein not understanding the tax form he was attempting to fill out. He told the one about the New York City kids not being allowed to pray in the cafeteria, neither of which were true. His nodding relationship to truth was characterized in this way in an article in the New Republic. Ronald Reagan has never let the facts get in the way of a good story. His critics would gnash their teeth and loudly proclaim his falsehoods, and yet debunking of his facts was largely seen as irrelevant during his presidency, meaning it didn't change his popularity or his ability to get things done. As Lewis notes in his analysis, Reagan used language in its most abstract form. He created myths and stories about Americans. Reagan referred to America as the shining city on the hill. His stories weren't always true, but for many, they were true to life. Or even more importantly, they were true to the lives his supporters aspired to. Fact-checking his speeches missed the point. So what is one to do when the material reality of the nation, at the time dealing with problems such as AIDS that was raging through the gay community and gross economic inequity, conflicts with the mythic narrative being presented? Do you point out the lies? Do you call the speaker a liar? No. You tell another story. This one was told by Mario Cuomo in the 1984 Democratic National Convention. He said, America is not a city on the hill. It's actually a tale of two cities. He agreed that there are bright elements in the nation, but then he added, there's another city. There's another part to the shining city, the part where some people can't pay their mortgages and most young people can't afford one, where students can't afford the education they need and middle-class parents watch the dreams they hold for their children evaporate. Cuomo understood that he could present information that was factual, but that wouldn't influence an audience that not only wanted something that was true, but also true to life. His speech is still considered one of the greatest in contemporary American society. So what do we take away from this example? Simply declaring something untrue isn't enough. We need to ask, why do people believe this falsehood? In what ways does it ring true to them? And we need to use language to its full range in response, from its ability to construct concrete facts to its ability to spin fantastical stories, which may have their own kind of truth, in an attempt to meet people where they are, not where we want them to be. Tell a better story.
All right, can everybody hear me? All right, I'm using it anyway. My name is Jason Gilmore. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, or what I come from. And I study both political communication and the presidency. So buckle up, here we go. So the first place I want to start, however, is I want to introduce to you a concept that you already know, that we might be in what we call an information age, right? This age where we have access to information at levels unprecedented in history. And that is indeed the truth, right? We can do this differently than any other generation before us because of our digital, our mobile technology. But there are those who argue that perhaps we're moving into a communication age, that things are changing because even though we still have access to all of this information, we are not equipped with the tools to be able to decipher between that information what is true, good, not good, untrue, lies. Right? So we're in an age now where it matters more how you communicate, right? How you tell the story than the information itself. So what this means is that sometimes in our voting behavior and the way we understand the world, it is sometimes more important what we believe to be true and what we want to believe to be true than what actually is true, right? And if we think about this in the context of the modern American presidency, which is where I spend my time, the first example that comes to mind is Barack Obama. Right? Barack Obama, throughout his presidency, his campaign, was challenged regularly about not being an American, about being Kenyan, about being Muslim, about the fact that he might bring Sharia law to the United States if he were elected president. All of these are factually incorrect, right? The jury's back. We know this information, right? And indeed, just because Barack Obama went and dressed in traditional dress doesn't make him Kenyan any more than this makes George W. Bush Korean, right? But people believe this to be true to date. Large swaths of people believe this to be true. Right? So it matters sometimes more what we believe to be true than what actually is true. And if you're wondering if there's bias in this and I'm only going to tell the Democratic story, let's take a look at a more contemporary example. That of the allegations that Donald Trump colluded with Russia in the 2016 elections. So if we think about this, there are a large, wide swath of people who believe this to be true, who believe that if we follow the smoke, it will inevitably lead us to fire. But nobody has that fire, nobody has that smoking gun, but they believe it to be true nonetheless. And if you look at how this is laid out in our press, we see on one side, MSNBC, the liberal side, making the connection. This is a done deal, the fire's there, we're there. In the case of Fox News on the other side, this is all hysteria, it's a ruse, there's nothing there, it's just Democrats trying to fool us. So if we think about how we process the information that's given to us in the modern age, it brings to mind a couple of concepts that I want to talk about. The first is that of selective exposure. A number of studies have shown that Americans tend to expose themselves only to information that reinforces their own worldviews and political ideologies. That in and of itself is a problematic thing. Right? In and of itself, that means we're only seeing information that does not challenge us. So that in and of itself, again, is a problem in our democracy that requires us to engage with one another, right, to achieve compromise. The second concept, however, I want to introduce is perhaps even more problematic, and that's of selective perception. And that when provided information, even that challenges your worldview, you will perceive it to reinforce your worldview, right? Melissa talked about this before. That if we look up here on the screen, those of us who are liberally minded will point and say, see, Fox News, pulling the wool over the eyes of them stupid Republicans. Republicans will point up there and say, see, MSNBC is just pulling the wool over the eyes of them sheep over there in the Democratic Party. And the third concept I want to introduce here is that of the third person effect. All of us individually believe that us and people like us are astute observers of information. That when we expose ourselves to this type of information, we can decipher what is true and what is biased and what is fake and what is not. But those idiots over there are totally affected by this. They're a bunch of sheep, right? And they are totally affected by this. The hook to the third person effect is that we are fundamentally wrong. We are all deeply affected by the information we expose ourselves to. And so if we create these little bubbles where all we see is information and all we're used to is information that furthers our own political viewpoint and our own political cause, then that opens us up for fake news. And the reason why fake news has been so incredibly impactful is because we are hardwired now to just see information that furthers our political view, and we then share it with our friends. So where I will leave this is a challenge to challenge ourselves to rise to higher principles, to require of ourselves a little bit more critical eye of how we view news and the information we expose ourselves to. And stop pointing at the splinter in somebody else's eye and recognize the log that is in our own, right? It's not those darn liberals over there. It's not those stupid Republicans over there. It's ourselves that we have control, right? My brother used to tell me every time I asked him for change comes from within, Jason. I'll leave it at that.
It's been around for a long time, but in today's fast-paced, consumer-driven, fragmented information environment, I think being able to identify fake news and think critically about it is more important than ever. And some of the things that my colleagues have brought up are making us more vulnerable than ever, I think, to fake news. So how am I defining fake news? What is fake news? I'm looking at it as news and information that people disseminate believing or knowing that it's false. This is fabricated news, and it's been around for centuries. Let's look back at the 1400s, 1475. A young child went missing, a young boy disappeared, and a Franciscan preacher claimed in his sermons that the Jewish community murdered the boy and drank his blood for Passover. Complete fabrication, complete lie, but it led to retaliation against the Jewish community. Let's move it up to the 1800s, 1835. The New York Sun newspaper ran a series of reports on furry, winged, bat-like people living on the moon. And there were also beavers walking around on two legs and all kinds of things, and temples made out of sapphires. Well, the reports were a complete fabrication, but they were attributed to a famous astronomer, and it turns out the reports were really just made up by the Sun editor, who knew that it would take weeks or potentially months for anybody to track down the deception. And in the meantime, the Sun's circulation went way up. They more than doubled their circulation figures. During World War II, a British journalist who was pretending to be a Hitler loyalist disseminated fake news over the radio to try to demoralize the German population. So we have a long history with fake news. This intentional, fabricated kind of information is important. It's worrisome because of the role we've given information and information providers in our society. In the past, we expected that our mass media and other information providers would bring us information that we needed to govern ourselves if we were going to be a representative democracy. Media would inform us. They would give us information that we needed to keep an eye on our government officials and the people they'd appointed. Also, we thought that we, as citizens, would actively seek information. We would sift through it. We would throw out what did not make sense, and we would arrive at truth with a capital T. The media had a role, and we as citizens had a role in this. Well, eventually we lost some of that optimism. We weren't so sure that we, or more likely third-person effect, we weren't so sure the people around us were really rational, active information seekers. They were not seeking truth. And we weren't so sure that the journalists were doing such a good job for us either. Were they really giving us the information that we needed? We sort of started to move toward the idea that, hey, if the media have this responsibility, if the media have this freedom under, like, the First Amendment, maybe they have a responsibility to society and to the rest of us. We didn't think that the media would always get it right. We knew they wouldn't, but we expected certain things of them. There were certain things that we thought media should be doing for us in our society. They should bring us facts and information that we could use. They should be transparent about their sources of information. We should be able to know where they're getting their information from. They should verify information for us. Generally help us sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, right? We weren't necessarily searching for truth with a capital T anymore. We recognized that maybe we could interpret the facts differently. Maybe there could be multiple truths. But we still expected that our information providers would give us facts around which we could then build a kind of a discussion as a society. I ran across an opinion piece recently that relates to this. It was by a scholar at Penn State named Christopher Beam. And Beam started by drawing on the work of political philosopher Hannah Arendt, who argued that democratic society should require that we first agree that there are such things as facts, that facts exist, and second, that we agree that we should try to present those facts as best we understand them. Beam goes on to make the point that if politicians don't stick to those two agreements about facts, it's hard for the rest of us to really know what to make of anything they're saying. And that makes discussion and debate kind of pointless. And that then imperils democracy. Well, I think this applies to more than just the politicians. I think it applies to the professional journalists, and I think it applies to everybody else who's spreading content, which brings us back to why fake news makes a difference. Given the volume of information available today, given how quickly it spreads, given how easy it is to share it, and given that we are all content creators today, thanks to social media and the internet, it can be really, really difficult to tell where our information is coming from. It can be really, really difficult to evaluate how reliable that information is. And as Penn State's Beam would remind us, this complicates our efforts to debate the major issues of the day and ultimately to govern ourselves. Our uncertainty is compounded when we factor in content providers who basically just make up stuff. So in a December 2016 survey done by the Pew Research Center, they surveyed more than 1,000 U.S. adults. 64% of those people said fabricated news stories cause a great deal of confusion about the basic facts of current events and issues. Also, the survey indicated that we as Americans have a fair amount of confidence in our own ability to identify fake news. But at the same time, 16% of the respondents admitted that they had at one point or another shared a story that they later discovered to be false. Third person effect, right? Well, we know how to identify fake news. Nobody else does. They're all confused about the issues, but in the meantime, we're sharing fake news. So we've got some confusion here. What can we do about it? What can we ultimately do about fake news? I'd like to suggest that we start by acknowledging 3 big points. First of all, we need to acknowledge that we need solid information as that can serve as a starting point for discussion and for debate if we're going to govern ourselves, tackle social issues, and so on. So no more of this looking only for information that supports our preconceived notions. No more assuming that anything we disagree with is automatically fake news and anything that we do agree with is automatically okay. Second, I think we need to acknowledge that we are, each of us, all of us, we are most likely getting some of our information from content providers who are trying to misinform us, either for their own sport or for political gain or commercial gain or whatever. So no more assuming that we can identify fake news, even though, I can identify it, but all the rest of you can't. And finally, I think we need to acknowledge that we hold some power in all of this. We don't have to be fooled by fake news. For one thing, there are traditional and new media outlets out there that emphasize balanced reporting, verification, reliable sourcing. Let's work some of those into our media mix. We can check sourcing. If if we're getting our news and information in stories and there are no sources given, that's a kind of a red flag, right? If there are sources given, don't just assume, oh great, there's a source. Let's look into those sources. Who are they? What are they? Are they reliable? We can track information back to its original source. Sometimes it's easier than you think it would be. You can go on a website and you can go to the About, click on the About Us, and they'll sometimes tell you we're making stuff up. They'll come right out and say it in some cases. Believe them when they tell you that. We can compare information from multiple sources. So if you happen to be a Fox News follower, check out MSNBC. Or if you have a certain set of blogs that you like to read, check out some other ones. Resist the temptation to share the information, the story you know is fake, just because you think your friends and family members are going to get a chuckle out of it. In the end, I think we need to go back to this idea that we can be active information seekers, because ultimately when it comes down to fake news, the burden's going to be on us.
Okay, it's time for questions, and I'm going to go back to the slide that shows the code if you want to answer or ask a question. Sorry, I should have done this in a better way. Here we go. And while I'm doing that, there it is. I'm going to pose the first question because I get to as the moderator. So here's the big question. Who cares? I mean, why should we bother telling the truth? Jen, you want to start?
Oh, geez. Sure. The problems we face are real. And I like how Cathy was talking about, as a democracy, the responsibility goes to us. We're not supposed to have, the strong leader who makes all the decisions for us. It's us who have to make the decisions, and we can pretend these problems aren't real or don't exist, but they really do, and their ramifications are enormous. And so how is a literate democratic society supposed to make decisions? Well, we're supposed to know stuff and vote based on those facts. And if we're being misled, given false information, we'll make bad decisions to our own peril. So it's that's why you should care.
We've got one question here that a lot of people have liked, so I'm going to start with that one. I've seen a lot of controversy over personal truth. When does personal truth, in scare quotes, change from truth to opinion? So maybe I'll throw that one at Melissa.
Yes, absolutely. I thought you were talking about the question. I'm like, no, that's still yours.
Mine made the terrible noise. I think
there is this idea that people have personal truths, right? But the difference comes from when that is your personal truth that you hold personally versus when you start to put that information out there as other people's truths. And I think that that's where a lot of what we've talked about today comes in, and that's what's been sort of talked about as happening, right? So assuming that that is other people's truths or trying to push that as fact might not be facts for everybody.
So what is the line, though, between personal truth and opinion, which is kind of embedded in this question? Anybody want to take that one? Are they the same thing? Okay, audience, you've stumped them. Yeah, anybody? Jason, you want to give it a try? Personal truth and opinion?
Let me see if this works. So the difference between personal truth and opinion, I don't think that's always a clear line. I think a lot of the time that's how we understand the world, is through our own opinions, is through our own kind of understanding of what we have decided is fact, is true. So I think it's difficult, especially in human interaction, for us to arrive at these decisions together, right? How do you define something that in somebody else's mind is just as true, right? So can we come to a definite definition of what opinion is versus truth? I think we can look at kind of on the ground facts. We can sometimes disagree on those as well. But do our best to, as Cathy had said, to corroborate the information that we're being given and to kind of take a scientific approach, which is the idea that we build knowledge off of knowledge, right? And that we challenge information as we go along to better understand the world through a robust understanding of it, outside of, all people who drive Volkswagens, I drive a Volkswagen, or whatever, which is not based in any real facts except for one or two observations, that we start to make that distinction between systematic observation that is collected over time and builds upon itself. I think we can definitely say that we can trust that better.
We've got a couple that are running neck and neck here on the question list. This was the first question posted. How do you think truthfulness relates to the art world? Do you think artists have an obligation to be truthful? I can say that Bertolt Brecht, the person that I mentioned at the very beginning, who was a playwright, would absolutely say yes, that is one of the main projects for an artist. But would any of you like to weigh in on this question of art? Anybody?
You guys clearly didn't hear what disciplines we came from. So we've had psych and art. So I'm winging it because I am not an artist. But I don't think so. I don't think art has to be true. I think art has to raise questions that get us to think. And so art may put a huge falsehood in front of us, and we have to decide what we want to do with that. What do we think about it? What questions does it raise? Does it, as I said in mine, does it ring true to us or not? And if it doesn't, that's fine. It gets us to think. So that's I want to I see artists and art people in the audience. I almost want to just hand off this microphone, but I won't.
I think we have artists on some of our later panels in the spring, so we can do that. All right, you all just want me to ask this question.
Hold on.
Everybody's
can I add
voting on
something?
this other one. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I think that artists can put, sort of a falsehood out there, but I would think that artists would be striving to be true to whatever their own vision is, whatever their intent there is, whatever they're trying to get across to the rest of us. So in that way, I do think they have to be searching for and trying to convey truth along that line, maybe. And again, I'm not an artist.
I think it depends on the type of art that's being represented. If you are an artist and you are writing a biography about somebody and the expectation is that there are facts and that is truth, then that is a situation where art should be representing truth, right, or facts.
So we think it depends on the art form that is being represented, right? Photoshop is all over and as truth, right? That it is how people actually look or things like that. And that is being represented as truth and not as some abstract art.
Snapchat.
And we do have a psychologist.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so the audience clearly wants me to ask this question. Is it okay to lie if the dress really does make her look fat? Or perhaps if the dress really does make him look fat. I'll just throw that out there. So what do you think? Is it okay to lie? I'm assuming you're asking, is it okay to lie if it will protect someone else's feelings? So, Cathy, you want to jump in?
Yeah. Well, again, this is sort of getting into my own personal code of ethics, but I've often thought, what if an active shooter came into my classroom and was looking for somebody specific? I wouldn't hesitate to lie. I would lie to protect that person. I would lie to protect a life. I would probably tell the fib and say that the dress doesn't make somebody look fat. I would do it knowing what I'm doing, and I'm doing it because I think the greater evil maybe would be to let the shooter kill somebody or let somebody's feelings be hurt unnecessarily.
Anybody else want to touch that one with a poll? Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and ask the next one. Do you think social media has a responsibility to eradicate fabricated stories? Should we expect social media users to educate themselves instead? So that's kind of two questions. Should Facebook be taking down stuff that they know is fabricated? What do you think? Communications people, you want to jump in?
I'll jump in. Do I think social media campaigns and companies should eradicate fake news? So if we look at newspapers engage in, at least the grand majority of newspapers engage in the practice of identifying what is the opinion area and what is factual news, investigative reporting, and they hold themselves to high standards in that the information that they collect, even if it is found to be needed to be corrected, that they will then correct that information. So how can we translate that to social media without taking out the ability of people to express themselves in whatever way they want? I mean, any of you in the room could sit in your basement and use Photoshop to create a meme that says that Donald Trump was endorsed by the Pope, or that Billy Graham endorsed Hillary Clinton. You're able to do that, and you're able to share it on Facebook. So it starts to ask that, or beg the question of are we then limiting our own free speech by limiting these bits of fake news? So I think there's a number of levels where this needs to be addressed. Number one is the idea of something that's generated by somebody from this room or somebody just from the general public who is using social media for the sake of social media, and then identifying strategic agents who are creating information from abroad as well as from inside of the United States as campaigns to smear certain candidates and so on. But how do you identify that? Right? Do you allow it to exist in that space and then find a way to tag it, which is what I think social media is attempting to do? But they promise, I think Facebook promised to hire 400,000 people, and I still don't think they're going to be able to filter out all the fake news. They're still not going to be able to filter out all those memes. So it's a difficult question that kind of straddles the line of freedom of speech as well as the potential impossibility of actually truncating the diffusion of it.
Well, and there's actually another follow-up question that I think maybe fits in here too, which is, what is satire? What's the line between satire and falsehood, satire and fake news? And I think that complicates the question of what social media providers should do. Anybody want to talk a little bit about satire and its role in all of this?
I think the role of satire, looking at it from a psychological perspective, is a time when we sort of come into conflict with our own values or our own beliefs. So satire sort of solidifies more what our values and beliefs are because they're in contrast. As to my thought about this in social media, I will pass that along. That is not, I might be the youngest one up here, but I do not participate in that. I think because for me, it is what it says, right? Social, so sort of more opinions, thoughts, things like that, but I don't go there for a news source.
I want to sort of cycle back to what Jason was saying. I think with the whole social media thing, I think it's going to be impossible to really police it effectively. And for me, in terms of straight fake news, in terms of satire, in terms of all of it, I think what it ultimately does come down to is us educating ourselves and paying a little bit more attention and being willing to put a little bit more effort into identifying this, taking a look at it and saying, is the intention to, is this intentional satire, parody, whatever, with the point of getting us to look at ourselves more critically, or is it somebody intentionally just trying to mislead us and put, or fabricated information out there? I really don't think that expecting government or expecting the social media companies to police it is going to be any kind of a fix for it. It really, I still think it comes back down to us, educating ourselves and just paying a little bit more attention to what's going on here. That's not easy, but I think that's going to be the ultimate answer.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. So as you were kind of walking through and talking about how it might be an impossibility, and at the end of the day, should we even try, right? So what it does come down to is us, right? So how do we do that is now the question. So at the end of the day, the best thing is that we would be better consumers of information, and not just better consumers of information where we filter the information, where we check that information to other sources. We see something kind of doesn't pass the gut check, that we then look at a couple of other sites, that we don't spend all of our time in the Fox Newses and the Huffington Post of the world because they make us feel oh so self-righteous. But they damage our ability to see other people's point of view. So it really does come down to us tasking ourselves to consume better, and then to demand better of those who purvey information to us. So I think that was an amazing point.
So can I pose a question to that then? So going to sort of like pop culture and psychological studies, so there are studies where, so it's sort of represented in the beginning of the Ghostbusters movie, where where students are being given a test, and they're testing their telepathy abilities, and they're saying whether the card is correct or not, and he tells the male student every time that he's wrong, and he's like right, like 70% of the time, and he tells the female student she's correct every time, and she is not. And there are psychological studies where they ask people to sort of evaluate two things and give the real or the fake, and they're given sort of false feedback, right? So somebody's given feedback, half of the people are given feedback that they're correct about 80% of the time, and the other half are given feedback that they're correct only 20% of the time. And going forward, then the researcher comes out and says, hey, guess what? That was totally arbitrary. What you answered made no difference of what we told you. And the people who were told that they were correct more still had a higher level of confidence that they actually were correct, even when told directly that that was not the case. But the people who were told that they were wrong repeatedly and then were told, guess what, we were just kidding, they did not evaluate themselves as being less confident, right? So they thought, well, in real, like if it was real, I really could be much better at doing this. So there is definitely a false belief and a bias in people's ability to sort of tease those things out. So if it's up to us and we are faulty,
what do you do?
Is this for me? Well, I think starting here in academia is the idea that we can provide tools to give people in between that moment of engendering a form of confidence off of that type of information. How do you then process that information, right? So to empower our students to have better tools, right? And those tools are to ask ourselves to take time before coming to conclusions about ourselves, about others. And that's difficult, right? I attempt it in my classrooms on a daily basis, and hopefully my students, whoever you are, hopefully you are learning those things, right? To separate out you from your brain, because again, your brain, or not again, this is again from my classes, you haven't heard me say this tonight. Your brain is going to offer you information that you need to evaluate before you spit it out your mouth, before you share it on Facebook. You need to start having those levels of filtering that comes in between thought and then in action, speech, things like that. And hopefully it's upon us right here in academia as one spot where we can empower that. On a societal level, I am perplexed by how we would enact that. But I'd like some of my students and myself to be at least up for the challenge. Somebody else want to add?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in here a little bit. We've been talking a lot about journalism, but I also teach interpersonal communication. And I was thinking about when you brought this in that there's also studies that show if you're comparing two lines, right, and one's clearly longer, and all the other people around you say the shorter line is longer, you're more likely to agree with them. Even though you can see it clearly. The line is shorter, but if everyone else says it's longer, you kind of nod along, right? So in addition to, surrounding ourselves and, checking our facts and things like that, we need to surround ourselves by people who are critically engaging in the world. Because if we only surround ourselves with people who agree with us and we all nod together, who's calling us in to check? Like, who's reminding us that maybe there's another way to see things, that we need diversity in terms of our friendship circles, and we need people around us who maybe disagree in a really respectful, engaging way. But that's how we can get past some of these tricks in our brains and some of these problems that we have in terms of fake news, is to engage with other people who ask us, where did that come from, right? They question some of the assumptions that we have. That's healthy.
Okay, we're almost out of time in this session. I thought maybe we should do Truth Ball to end. I'm not going to actually throw the ball at you, but we will be going after this to a reception and more Q&A across the hall, and I'm going to start the Q&A over there with this question. What about truth in the religious realm in a world where religion and science are in a constant struggle over the domination of what is true? So you can be ruminating on that. But let's do a truth ball real fast. So I'll start with lies, and it goes to Cathy.
Fake news.
Bias.
Learning.
Truth. All right. I think that's a good place to end. Join me in thanking the panel.